The room was dead quiet. Outside, a brutal gale battered the English Channel. 30-foot waves, 45-mile-per-hour winds, a sky so thick with storm clouds that even the moon had gone into hiding. Every military man in that room knew what that weather meant: another delay. Another day of 156,000 soldiers sitting in ships, sick with nerves, waiting for a green light that kept not coming. Then General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood up. He had the weather report in his hand. It was, in his own words, the worst report you ever saw. But folded inside that grim forecast was something else: a narrow, fragile, 18-hour window of passable weather expected on the morning of June 6th. Eisenhower looked around the room. He looked at his British Deputy Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. He looked at British General Bernard Montgomery. He looked at British Admiral Bertram Ramsay. Then he said four words that would echo through the rest of human history. "Okay, we'll go." The room cleared in 2 seconds. And with that, the man from Abilene, Kansas, the son of a poor railroad worker, a man who had never led troops in combat before 1942, set in motion the largest seaborne invasion in the history of the world. His name was on the order. His was the hand that signed it. And when he sat alone later that night, he pulled out a second piece of paper and began to write a letter he hoped he would never have to send. It read, in part, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Eisenhower was willing to take full blame for failure. What he was far less willing to do, as Britain would discover in the years that followed, was watch someone else take full credit for the victory. To understand why the credit dispute over D-Day matters so much, you first have to understand how complicated and how contentious the road to June 6 truly was. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the alliance with Britain was forged almost overnight. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was so relieved to have America in the war that he sailed across the Atlantic on the battleship HMS Duke of York and spent Christmas at the White House. But the alliance was never simple. From the very beginning, the Americans and the British disagreed, loudly and often bitterly, about how to defeat Nazi Germany. The American generals, men like Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, wanted to go straight at Germany, cross the English Channel, land in France, and fight the Germans head-on. They believed delay was dangerous. Every month they waited was another month the Soviet Union bled out on the Eastern Front. Every month they waited was another month Hitler had to strengthen his Atlantic Wall fortifications along the coast of France. Churchill and his generals had a completely different philosophy. Britain had been at war since September 1939. By the time America entered, the British were, as historian Carlo D'Este put it, running on fumes. The memory of the Somme, where Britain lost 57,000 men in a single day during World War I, never left Churchill's mind. He had also witnessed the catastrophic British defeat at Dunkirk in 1940, where over 338,000 Allied troops had to be evacuated off a beach in retreat. He had seen disaster at Gallipoli decades earlier. He carried those wounds. Churchill's strategy was to wear Germany down from the edges first, through North Africa, through Sicily, through Italy, before attempting the main invasion of France. His approach was cautious and deliberate. The Americans often suspected he was using these peripheral campaigns to protect British imperial interests in the Mediterranean, rather than actually shortening the war. Many on the American side felt the British were simply too frightened of the Germans to fight them directly. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Churchill was right that an invasion of France in 1942 or 1943 would likely have ended in catastrophe. The forces were not ready. The logistics were not in place, and the Allied armies lacked the combat experience they would gain in North Africa and Italy. But by repeatedly steering strategy away from a cross-channel invasion, Churchill burned through enormous reserves of American patience and goodwill. By 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had made up his mind. The invasion of France would happen in the spring of 1944, and someone needed to command it. On December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt made a brief, folksy announcement to Eisenhower that would change the world. He said simply, "Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord." The choice of Eisenhower was not without controversy. He had only led his first troops in combat in 1942 during the invasion of North Africa. He had made mistakes there, significant ones. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces under the broader Allied command suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of German General Erwin Rommel. Back in London, a home intelligence report noted that ordinary British citizens reacted to news of American military setbacks with barely concealed satisfaction. One vegetable seller in Covent Garden was overheard saying, "Good news today, sir," referring not to an Allied victory, but to a reverse suffered by Eisenhower's army. The British establishment, by and large, did not believe Eisenhower was up to the job. Churchill privately called him a genial and dynamic mediocrity. His closest generals believed he was neither bold nor decisive, and neither a leader nor a general. They expected to manage him. They expected to guide him. They were wrong. By January 1944, when Eisenhower arrived in London to take command of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, he was a transformed man. He had learned from his mistakes in North Africa and the Mediterranean. He had developed, in the words of the U.S. National Park Service, a mature, flexible, and tough leadership style. He had learned the art of coalition warfare, how to manage egos, absorb criticism, and still make hard decisions. He also understood something very important about Winston Churchill, that the Prime Minister needed to be handled as much as he needed to be listened to. Almost immediately after taking command, Eisenhower found himself in a war with Churchill, not with Germany, but within the alliance. The dispute was over something called the Transportation Plan. Eisenhower wanted to bomb the French railway and road system before the invasion, knock out bridges, destroy rail yards, cut off the German army's ability to rush reinforcements to Normandy once the landings began. His air commanders had studied the maps. The plan was logical, militarily sound, and in Eisenhower's view, absolutely critical to the success of Operation Overlord. Churchill opposed it furiously. His concern was partly humanitarian. Bombing France meant killing French civilians, the very people the Allies were supposed to be liberating. But historians have noted that the humanitarian argument was largely secondary. The deeper issue was that Churchill believed the Royal Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Germany, pounding German oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and industrial centers inside the Reich, was the better path to victory. The RAF's top brass were convinced they could win the war on their own in 6 months. They didn't want their planes pulled away to bomb French train stations. Eisenhower was unmoved. He told his opponents that their oil plan was irrelevant to the invasion itself. The Germans had fuel hidden in camouflage depots all across France. Bombing oil plants in Germany would not stop German tanks from moving toward Normandy on D-Day. By March 22, 1944, Eisenhower had reached his limit. He dictated a sharp memo documenting the entire history of the dispute. Then he went further. He told his deputy, British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, one of the few British officers who fully backed him, "By God, you tell that bunch that if they can't get together and stop quarreling like children, I will tell the Prime Minister to get someone else to run this damned war. I'll quit." He was not bluffing. He formally threatened to inform the combined chiefs of staff that if the matter was not settled immediately, he would request relief from his command. The threat worked. Churchill eventually signed off on the transportation plan, though he tried to diffuse responsibility by passing the question up to President Roosevelt for final approval. FDR told Churchill that military considerations trumped humanitarian concerns. The bombing would proceed. Eisenhower had won. Eisenhower, who always claimed not to know anything about politics, historian Robert Citino has noted, actually was a supremely political general. I think he knew exactly what impact his threat to resign would have. Churchill's opposition to the invasion did not end with the transportation plan dispute. He continued to propose alternative strategies almost until the eve of D-Day, a landing in Norway, an attack on Bordeaux, before finally being reined in by both the British and American chiefs of staff. There was one more extraordinary episode. Churchill announced that he intended to personally sail with the invasion fleet and watch the landings from HMS Belfast. If Eisenhower did not like it, the Prime Minister said, he would simply arrange a naval commission for himself and go anyway. Eisenhower was appalled. Having the Prime Minister of Great Britain on a warship during the largest amphibious assault in history was a security nightmare, an operational distraction, and a political crisis waiting to happen. He appealed to King George VI. The king, in a remarkable diplomatic maneuver, announced that if Churchill was going, then he was going too, and then, when Churchill resisted, the king conceded that perhaps they had both better stay home. Churchill was outmaneuvered by his own monarch. By the time June 5th arrived, Churchill had come around. At the final briefing for senior officers at St. Paul's School in London on May 15th, General John Kennedy recorded in his diary that Churchill spoke in a robust and even humorous style, and concluded with a moving expression of his hopes and good wishes. He looked much better than at the last conference and spoke with great vigor, urging offensive leadership. Whatever his private doubts, Churchill stood with the invasion in public. On the night of June 5th, as the fleet crossed the Channel, he reportedly told his wife Clementine, "Do you realize that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed?" On June 6, 1944, the world changed. The invasion fleet alone consisted of nearly 7,000 naval vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, and hundreds of supply and merchant ships, drawn from 8 different navies. Some 12,000 aircraft supported the operation. The operation began just after midnight with the landing of approximately 24,000 American, British, and Canadian airborne troops, dropped by parachute and glider behind enemy lines to secure the flanks of the beaches. At 6:30 in the morning, the sea assault began. The target was 80 kilometers, 50 miles of the Normandy coast, divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. American forces landed at Utah and Omaha. British forces landed at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces landed at Juneau. By the end of D-Day, nearly 160,000 Allied troops had come ashore. The British and Canadians put approximately 75,215 troops on the beaches. The Americans put 57,500 ashore, a figure that would grow enormously in the weeks that followed. Allied casualties on June 6 are estimated at over 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Of those, 6,603 were Americans, 2,700 were British, and 946 were Canadian. The highest casualties of any single beach occurred at Omaha, where American troops faced horrifying German fire from the bluffs above. Over 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing at Omaha alone on June 6. Over 34,000 Americans came ashore at that beach in a single day. By the end of June, the Allies had landed more than 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and nearly 150,000 vehicles across the Normandy beaches. In the entire Battle of Normandy, the Allies committed 39 divisions, 22 American, 12 British, 3 Canadian, 1 Polish, and 1 French. American personnel in Britain alone, staged for the invasion, totaled 2,876,439 officers and men. The United States had shipped 7 million tons of supplies to the staging area, including 450,000 tons of ammunition. These numbers matter. They matter enormously. Because in the years that followed, as the victorious nations wrote their histories and told their stories, the question of who deserved the credit for D-Day became far more contested than it had any right to be. Winston Churchill was many things. He was brave, brilliant, and one of the greatest orators in the history of the English language. He was also a man acutely conscious of his place in history. He kept no personal diary during the war, as he once explained, because it would expose his follies and inconsistencies to posterity. But once the war was over, he went to work writing a 6-volume history of the Second World War that would become one of the most celebrated and most strategically self-serving war memoirs ever published. Churchill's memoirs were, as historian Max Hastings bluntly observed, poor history, if often peerless prose. Churchill wrote the war the way he wanted it to be remembered. He minimized his prolonged resistance to a cross-channel invasion. He magnified Britain's contributions. He shaped the narrative. Meanwhile, throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a quiet but unmistakable cultural tendency took root in Britain. A tendency to remember D-Day as something that Britain had made happen, that British forces had dominated, that the whole enterprise had been a fundamentally British achievement with Americans playing a supporting role. This was not a formal claim. Churchill did not hold a press conference and announce that Britain deserved the lion's share of the credit for the Normandy landings. It was subtler than that, a tone in the memoirs, a framing in the speeches, a national narrative that emphasized British endurance, British planning, and British sacrifice, while the enormous American contribution was quietly understated. Eisenhower noticed. The thing about Eisenhower is that he was not a man who picked unnecessary fights. He had spent the entire war proving that he could work with the British, that he respected their contribution, and that coalition warfare required humility and grace on all sides. When he spoke at London's Guildhall on June 12, 1945, one of the great speeches of the post-war world, he said, "Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends." He meant it. But humility was not the same as silence. And as Britain's post-war narrative began to reshape the story of D-Day in ways that distorted the historical record, Eisenhower pushed back, not in anger, not with personal attacks on Churchill, but with the quiet, persistent authority of a man who had been in that room, who had signed that order, and who had written that unsent letter taking personal responsibility for failure. In his own war memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, Eisenhower was diplomatically careful but unmistakably clear about the scale of the American effort. He documented the vast American contribution to Operation Overlord in concrete, verifiable terms. He praised Churchill as a wartime leader of extraordinary courage and resilience. But he also made it plain that the supreme commander of the operation had been an American, that the majority of the troops in the eventual Normandy campaign were American, and that the strategic decisions about when, where, and how to launch had been made by him, not by Churchill, not by the British chiefs of staff, and not by Field Marshal Montgomery. He noted pointedly that while Churchill might express his private doubts in intimate meetings, the Prime Minister would always say publicly, "We are committed to this operation of war." Eisenhower's framing was generous, but the implication was clear. Churchill had been brought along to support a plan he had spent years trying to delay. On Churchill's long resistance to the cross-channel invasion, Eisenhower was notably even-handed in public, but to those close to him, his private view was sharper. Churchill had been a complicating force in the lead-up to Overlord, not a driving one. The British Prime Minister had proposed alternatives to a direct assault on France almost until the last moment. It had taken American pressure, backed by Soviet insistence at the Tehran Conference in November and December 1943, to finally lock in the commitment to a spring 1944 invasion of France. At Tehran, it was Stalin who demanded a firm date and a named commander. It was Roosevelt who chose Eisenhower. Churchill, by that point, had run out of room to maneuver. On June 12, 1945, 6 days after the first anniversary of D-Day, Eisenhower stood in the Guildhall in London to receive the freedom of the city, one of Britain's highest honors. He had just overseen the total defeat of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe was over. He could have used that moment to settle scores. He could have listed every time Churchill had opposed the transportation plan, every time the British had tried to redirect strategy away from France, every time he himself had been underestimated by the British military establishment that once called him neither bold nor decisive. He chose not to. Instead, he gave a speech about the debt that soldiers owe to each other, about the irrelevance of national boundaries on the battlefield, and about shared sacrifice as the only true measure of victory. It was one of the most gracious speeches ever delivered by a military commander. But grace has limits, and in the years that followed, Eisenhower made clear through his memoirs, through private correspondence, and through the documentary record that the narrative of D-Day had to rest on facts, not on national mythology. The facts were these. The supreme commander of Operation Overlord was an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The commander of all Allied ground forces during the initial invasion was a British officer, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, but overall strategic authority rested with Eisenhower. The naval commander of the invasion fleet was a British admiral, Sir Bertram Ramsay. The Allied Expeditionary Air Force was commanded by British Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. The operation was, genuinely and authentically, a joint effort. But the scale of the American contribution to Overlord was staggering. By the end of the Battle of Normandy, of the 39 Allied divisions committed to the fight, 22 were American. More American troops were killed at Omaha Beach on a single day than all British casualties combined at Gold and Sword Beaches. The total American material contribution to staging the invasion, the supplies, the ammunition, the ships, the aircraft, the men, dwarfed that of every other Allied nation. And critically, the decision to launch on that stormy morning of June 5th turning into June 6th had been made by one man alone. Okay, we'll go. In 1964, 20 years after D-Day, Eisenhower returned to Normandy with CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite. He stood at the American Cemetery in St. Lawrence-sur-Mer, where 9,387 Americans are buried, most of them killed in the landing operations and the battle to hold the beachhead. He told Cronkite, "I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. We must find some way to work and to gain an eternal peace for this world." He stood among the headstones of white Italian marble, a Latin cross for most, a Star of David for others, and said almost nothing. His grandson David has recalled that Eisenhower almost never spoke about World War II in private. World War II was not that safe a topic, David Eisenhower explained. The decisions had been too consequential, the losses too real, to be the subject of casual conversation. But the historical record spoke for itself, and when it was challenged, Eisenhower responded, not with public outrage, but with the measured authority of a man who had been there. The credit dispute between Britain and the United States over D-Day was never a formal argument. There was no single moment where Churchill stood at a podium and claimed that Britain had won the Normandy landings single-handedly. That would have been absurd on its face. The dispute was more insidious than that. It was a slow drift in public memory, a gradual reshaping of the story, a national tendency to remember one's own sacrifices most vividly and other nations' contributions most hazily. Eisenhower understood this. He had watched it happen in real time, from the vegetable seller in Covent Garden, who celebrated American setbacks, to the British military establishment that had privately dismissed him as mediocre. He had been underestimated, resisted, and patronized, and he had responded by commanding the most successful military operation in history. What Eisenhower told Churchill, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but through years of documented record, memoir, speech, and the blunt mathematics of military history, was something like this. We did this together, but we did not do it equally. The supreme commander was an American. The majority of the troops were American. The majority of the dead were American. The decision to go was mine, and if it had failed, I would have taken the blame alone. He said it with the facts, and the facts have never stopped saying it. The story of Eisenhower, Churchill, and D-Day is not ultimately a story about rivalry or resentment. It is a story about something much more important: the difference between the people who drive history and the people who narrate it. Winston Churchill was, without question, one of the most consequential leaders of the 20th century. Without his refusal to surrender in 1940, without his iron resistance to Hitler in Britain's darkest hour, there may not have been a free world left to be liberated in 1944. That contribution is real and permanent and should never be minimized. But Churchill was also, in the end, a man who tried to control how history remembered him. His war memoirs won him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, in no small part because they were brilliantly written. They were also strategically shaped. Churchill died in January 1965 as one of the most celebrated figures in human history, remembered primarily as the man who had saved Western civilization. Eisenhower outlived him by 4 years, dying in March 1969. He was remembered as the man who had commanded the liberation of Europe, and as the American president who built the interstate highway system and warned about the military-industrial complex. His name is on no great literary prize. His memoirs are workmanlike rather than majestic. He was not a mythmaker. He was, however, a man who had said, "Okay, we'll go," on a stormy night in June 1944, who had written a note in his pocket accepting personal blame for failure, and who had then watched 160,000 men storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied France under his command and succeed. The credit for D-Day belongs, in the largest and most accurate historical sense, to every soldier, sailor, and airman who crossed that channel or jumped from those planes, to the Americans at Omaha who climbed the bluffs under machine gun fire, to the British at Sword and Gold, to the Canadians at Juno, to the French resistance fighters who cut 500 sections of railway line in a single night, to the planners, the deception teams, the meteorologists who found that 18-hour window in the storm. But when the question is asked, who commanded it, who decided it, who bore the final responsibility, the answer is the same as it was on the night of June 5, 1944. One man sat in that room. One man read the weather report. One man said 4 words: "Okay, we'll go." And his name was Dwight David Eisenhower. If you want to understand the real story of D-Day, not the myth, not the national narratives, but the complicated, contentious, often fractious reality of how the greatest military operation in history actually came together, the answer is in the record. Eisenhower's memos, his memoirs, his private letters, his threat to resign, his note in his pocket on the morning of June 6th. A man who was willing to take full blame for failure has earned the right to receive full credit for success. That is what Eisenhower told Churchill, and what history has continued to say ever since.